Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikis's Digital Classics Summer Term 2022. Today we have our sixth session of this semester, and today I'm very happy that our guest is Konstantin Schulz from Berlin, and we have a session today about the Machina Callida, and we will see what is this project. And Konstantin is a researcher at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He has been working a lot on corpus linguistics, historical languages, and today he will talk about this specific project, the so-called Machina Callida. And today also Andrea Beyer, a colleague from Berlin, a colleague of Konstantin, was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately she was not able to join us. But anyway, she has been working with Konstantin on this project. And as usual, you have the description of this class, the class outline in GitHub, and you can find the link below the video in YouTube, where you have a complete description of this session. You have seminar readings, further reading, and resources, and also in the end an exercise that Konstantin will explain later. And you also have slides in Zenodo with the DOI. And the project, the Machina Callida, is part of the research project Callidus. And reading the description of Callidus. So Callidus is an interdisciplinary research project that delivers new methods of vocabulary acquisition in Latin. And its main purpose is to show the use of corpus-based methods in real teaching environments. So the interesting thing about this project is to see how we can use linguistic resources for historical languages, of course, and in this specific case for Latin, to learn and to teach historical languages using methods from computational linguistics and corpus linguistics. But now I think that we can leave the floor to Konstantin. So Konstantin, thank you very much for being with us today. So this is your first session for Sunoikis Digital Classics, I think. So really, thank you for your contribution today, and welcome to Sunoikis.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thanks for the nice introduction, and I'm happy to be here. And so today I'll talk about our research project, Callidus, and the associated software called Machina Callida. And I'll try to introduce all of you a bit to corpus-based Latin language acquisition and give some outlook on research. When we talk about this software, I will first introduce you to the motivation, so why we actually started this project and why learning Latin could be a problem or is a problem for many people. And I'll say a few things about how we can improve the situation and find possible solutions, and how we can measure and evaluate our interventions and our improvements. And in the end, I'll say a few things about how the software can be used not only for teaching and learning Latin, but also for some research. So let me start by giving you a few details about the circumstances of the project. So, of course, we're dealing with one specific historical language, namely Latin, and we have a specific target audience. That means that we're addressing only certain people and not everybody. So in our case, it's teachers and intermediate learners. And the intermediate is important because our software is not intended to be like the first go-to when you first start learning Latin, but it rather assumes that you already have some previous knowledge and some previous background on Latin. And also, we don't focus on all the aspects of language learning, but particularly on vocabulary acquisition and vocabulary training. And so you will hear a lot about lexical correlations and methods and ways of making vocabulary acquisition work, but not so much about syntax or morphology or other aspects. But of course, there's some overlap. And so the project was funded by the German Research Foundation for 3 years. In the end, it it ended in 2021. So what was the situation that we found before starting this project, or why did we have the idea of building such a software? So we looked at the current state of teaching and learning Latin, especially in Germany. And what we found is that the vocabulary that students are supposed to learn is often based on raw frequencies. So people scan through large corpora or text collections of Latin texts, and they just count the words. And the words that occur most frequently are supposed to be part of the basic vocabulary. And then in these approaches, people only look at the single words, right? So they just split in the text everything between the white space, and then they say, okay, every single word counts as one instance. So there's no room for some context or for phrases that consist of multiple words or something. This is all broken up into single units. And when they have built such a vocabulary, there's not really some quality assurance. So there's not a standard way of evaluating the quality of your vocabulary or the quality of your vocabulary training. And so what people usually do then to practice their vocabulary knowledge is that they create some homework exercises that students are supposed to handle, but this happens very rarely. So usually there's no explicit place or time in teaching for vocabulary. Instead, people usually focus on translation, which they assume to be equal. So they assume that if students can translate, that they also know all the vocabulary. But this does not necessarily have to be the case. And so what we find in the usual vocabulary tests when teachers want to evaluate the performance of the students is that they just build word equations between the first language and Latin. And the first language would, of course, usually be German in Germany. In other countries, it might be something else. But the important part is that they just put single words on either part of this equation. And that if you can complete this kind of single word equation, then you have successfully passed the vocabulary test. Also, in those equations, teachers usually use only the basic word forms, also known as lemmas or lemmata. So there's not a lot of inflection, which would of course be important for reading ancient texts. And when they give feedbacks to students, whether the answers were good or bad, this is usually just done in a binary fashion. So you either get 1 point for a single answer or you don't get it. But there's nothing in between. There's usually nothing like, okay, you were very close or you tried very hard, so you get half a point or something. There's no grayscale. And the feedback is always given explicitly. So you can see maybe with a red marker the points that you got in your test, but there's no additional implicit feedback that you can gather from other sources or other interactions. And finally, the feedback that you get from the teachers is always delayed because the teacher needs some time to correct your test and to evaluate it. And so actually, when you get the feedback in terms of grades or marks, then usually a few days or maybe a week has already passed. And you may not even remember what you had written when doing the tests. So the thing is that some of these issues are not necessarily due to Germany being bad at vocabulary teaching and training, but some of these issues stem from the fact that Latin is a historical language. And in historical languages, you cannot just go and talk to people and get implicit feedback by hearing native speakers native speakers talk. So when you hear native speakers talk, you can assume that most of the utterances that they produce are in a way correct, or would be the norm, the target that you want to achieve. And but for historical languages, this is not possible. So we can only read some texts, but you cannot hear people talk, at least most of the time. Also, the vocabulary is, most of the people decouple this from syntax and morphology, but it's actually all related to each other. So as I said, you will find, of course, inflected word forms in a given ancient text, and it will also be ordered in a way which also contributes to the actual meaning in the end. So you should not consider vocabulary as a single absolute phenomenon, but rather as interwoven with other aspects of linguistics. And then, of course, there are also some psychological or pedagogical aspects like rote learning. So usually when people try to learn new words, they are just presented with a list and some meanings, and then they just try to memorize it by heart. But memorizing things by heart has some weaknesses, especially over a longer period of time. So you will probably forget a lot of that after some time. And also, all the learners in a group are usually presented with the same input. So they learn the same words, they read the same texts, and there's no differentiation, no individual adaptation of the learning content. And this is problematic because in psychology, some people assume that for each person, when a person learns, there's a specific zone where the person is currently situated in. And when you want to learn something new, you need to move forward from that zone. So which is called the zone of proximal development. And you would ideally find new words that are very close to those that you already know, so that the step for learning the new word is rather small. And that's why it's called proximal. And also, when people receive feedback in those tests, it's usually not a scaffolding feedback. It's just the feedback just takes away the whole learning process and just shows you the result. Is it correct or not? But in scaffolding feedback, you actually don't show people right away what is right or wrong, but instead you provide only little hints and give some small advice so that they can take one step at a time and improve their performance until they finally get to a point where you say, okay, now I have reached my goals and I have learned this new word. And for some people, they will need only a few hints and a little bit of advice, but other people will need more structure. And the structure can be compared to some kind of scaffolding. So it just basically helps you climb up on the way to mastering all the Latin words. And finally, there's actually not really a gold standard or a common reference as to which words belong to the desirable vocabulary and the words that we should learn. So people are not really unanimous about this. There's no consensus, and the people just invent new lists and say that their own list is better than other lists, and but there's not really a common ground for these kinds of decisions. And so let us have a closer look at specific issues. So one of the things that I mentioned was the decontextualization. So if you only look at single words, and like in a dictionary, for example, you will find a lemma, for example, for res. And then in the German dictionary, it will say something, okay, it means thing. And but then in a given Latin text, of course, you will find combinations of res with other Latin words, like publica or familiares and so on. And there you cannot really use this basic meaning that you have acquired at some point because those combinations of word, they are also called collocations, have a very specific, almost idiomatic meaning. And so you just need to learn some additional units as is. So you cannot just add the two meanings of res and publica. Instead, you have to learn the specific combination. And you have to see it a few times until you have learned that this is a special combination, and it's a fixed phrase that you need to remember. So actually, research in linguistics and specifically in language acquisition has shown since a long time that learning words in context always helps, because you cannot just see this in written communication like in Latin, but also in oral communication. Just by talking to people, you are often in situations where you use words that can have multiple meanings. And then in order to know what is actually the meaning of a certain word, you need to disambiguate by inferring from the context, which could be the place that you are situated in, or the time when you are talking, or the person that you are talking to. So you have a lot of additional information that you need to consider to determine a word's meaning. And of course, this is also valid when reading Latin texts. And also, researchers have studied how learners read texts. And when they skim through a text like word by word, they often already have expectations. So, for example, when you say res, some students might already expect that the word publica or familiaris will follow, because they have seen this combination very often. But in theory, of course, there could be like any kind of adjective or some verb afterwards. But some of those options are more likely than the others. And these will influence people's expectations. And if you have expectations that closely match the actual wording in text, then it will be easier for you to read and understand the text. And the same goes, of course, for conversation again. And finally, when we talk about context is not just 2 or 3 words, but instead it could be whole sentences. And sometimes you even need additional explanations, like glosses or something. So this really depends on what you want to learn. So what we try to come up with in a project is a way to learn Latin vocabulary, Latin words that is closely tied to the insights from the research, from the linguistics research, and to facilitate this kind of training, and also to study the effect on the actual vocabulary knowledge in Latin learners. We decided to build a software which would support our approach. So we decided that the software should, of course, be easily accessible without installation, and should be accessible at all times, day and night, 24/7. And it should, of course, contain such contexts, authentic contexts. So texts written by native speakers, by Latin authors, and not by people that have just learned Latin maybe a few years ago. And so then we went on to consider what additional requirements might be to build such a software and to provide those texts. So of course we need the wording of the text itself, and it needs to be machine readable. So a computer should be able to process those texts and maybe manipulate it in a way that serves language acquisition. And the same goes, of course, for the vocabulary. So if we have curated lists of important words or phrases, then of course those should also be machine readable, and we need a good citation system. So when you read printed text editions of Latin text, you usually have references to other works, either in the footnotes by the editor, or maybe by the author himself even. And these references are usually kind of standardized, because over the centuries, people have more and more agreed on certain common ways of referring to ancient texts. And this same kind of common reference system has to be provided for the machine as well. And Then, of course, we don't just always want to work only with the text, because, as I told you, raw frequencies might not be the most efficient way to learn, to acquire vocabulary. So we want some annotations on the text, either manual or automatic, and the annotations could pertain to, of course, for example, lemmatization, but also to parts of speech or other linguistic aspects. The resulting corpora that with their annotations should, of course, be searchable, because we don't want to go through the whole Latin literature all the time, but usually we are interested in specific parts of it. So that's quite obvious. And then when we have some interesting parts, some texts that we want to read or some vocabulary that we want to learn, then of course we want to provide some exercises in different formats, maybe also combinations of exercises. And some of these should be created by the users themselves, because so that they can use the software according to their own needs. But some users maybe don't know how to create such exercises, or maybe they don't have the time, and then they just want some curated, ready-made exercises that are already available. So these should be included as well. And finally, we might be interested in creating some environment where people can actually execute those exercises and perform some tests, and where the software also remembers their previous results and so on. So these were our requirements, and this is what the general architecture looks like. So if we start, for example, at the lower left, there you have some textbooks, for example, that are being used in German schools for teaching Latin. From there, we have extracted the Latin texts in those textbooks. And also, of course, there are public text repositories like the Perseus Digital Library or the Perseids platform. And these we have also used as a basis for our software. And the third option for Latin texts that we included were tree banks. So tree banks on the lower part of the figure, for example, Proil and AGLDT. So tree banks are basically collections of texts that have been linguistically annotated by researchers or experts. And so these are texts with high quality additional annotations. And these are, of course, ideally suitable for supporting language learning. So we wanted to definitely have them in our software as well. So from all these texts, we can, of course, extract the wording, and then when we collect some corpora and some text collections, and for those, when we want to cite single works or authors, we can use, for example, the canonical text services, and which is based on the cite architecture. It's a protocol for citing texts, and there basically every author has their own ID, and also every text has its own ID. So you can uniquely identify everything in your text corpus. And when we have that, we can either look up or add some linguistic information by using dependency parsers like UDpipe, where you would process the texts and maybe add some information about syntax, for example, because syntax is also important for learning vocabulary. And when we have those annotated texts, we of course want to store these additional annotations, and we want to be able to search for them. So we have a specific custom-made search and storage engine called ANIS, which was also developed at Humboldt University in Berlin, and it's open source software, so everybody can use it, and we also used it in our platform. So then it becomes easy to find the right texts and the right annotations for your vocabulary training. And once we have found the correct annotations and the correct text, then we create our first exercises. And for that, we use an interactive exercise framework called H5P, which is nice because it's web-based, so you can view it in any browser. It has integrations for some learning management systems like Moodle. So if you use some LMS, some learning management system, then you can directly edit and open those H5P exercises in there. So you can have different exercises combined to a specific course or something, or to a sequence. And for those exercises, we of course use some vocabulary lists as well, and we use the core vocabularies that are popular in Germany, called BWS, the Bamberger Wortschatz, like Bamberg core vocabulary. And then, of course, we also collected vocabulary lists from the tree banks, so that people have different options for choosing some lexical support and inventory for their exercises. So now let me introduce you to some ways how we tried to actually implement that in a real world setting. So I will show you some examples. So first, of course, you can select from a lot of Latin authors in the software, so that we try to adapt our software to different needs. So because we know that different schools and different teachers will require different authors to be read in Latin, so they have a lot of options to choose from. And unfortunately, the quality of the text, of the machine generated text is not machine generated, but the machine readable text is quite different, because for some texts we have high quality annotations, like from the tree banks, but for most of the text we don't have that, and we provide it automatically. But the automatic annotations are of course not perfect, and there will be some errors in there. And we try to make all of our exercises work intralingually, so they are basically Latin only. Sometimes they have some small instructions, like please highlight all the relevant words or fill the gap or something, but still the main text body is only in Latin, and so you can basically use our software with almost any language, because you only have to change the language of the small instruction. And so currently we offer only English and German for those instructions, but we already have some basic integration for Spanish, for example, and it's very easy and a fast process to add other languages. So, and we did this because we believe that the more you interact with those exercises in the target language, in Latin, the more you will grow accustomed and the more you will learn. So this was an important choice. And our exercises have different focuses. So some rely more on the form, some more on meaning of the function. So we actually have a very broad understanding of vocabulary trading and vocabulary knowledge. And we believe that there are many different aspects. So we try to cover many of them with different setups and exercise formats. So when you have chosen a specific author and text, and then of course you might want to create your own exercise. So you can set various parameters. For example, you might want to create a close exercise, and then so this is just about the interaction type. So what do students need to do to complete this exercise? Then you have some linguistic phenomenon, like part of speech or the syntax or the lemmata. So you might want to focus on different aspects at different times. And when you have chosen a specific phenomenon, like part of speech, then you can restrict your exercise even more by selecting only specific parts of speech. So you can choose one or more. You could, for example, say, okay, my students have problems translating or understanding like small Latin words. So if you're interested in the small and short Latin words, then you would choose maybe conjunctions or adverbs and then focus on that. And of course, for each exercise, you can provide your own instructions in the language of your choice, and you can also provide some additional feedback. Now, when you have created that exercise, it might look like this, and as you can see, you have the option above the exercise to exclude unknown words. So if you provide a core vocabulary or a list of words that your students are supposed to know, then the text might contain some words that are not in that vocabulary. So you could assume that the students cannot possibly already know those words and cannot handle them in an exercise. So they would still, of course, remain in the text, but you have the option to remove them from the pool of solutions. So if in this case of a close exercise, the gaps are only made up of words that students can actually know and have already encountered. And words that they have never seen before would be excluded from those gaps and would just remain part of the plain text. And when you have completed the exercise, you get some visual feedback in red and green. So of course, that's just binary again. So it's right or wrong. So it's not really very advanced, but at least it's immediate. So it's not delayed. You don't get it 1 week later, but you get it like right now when you complete the exercise. And of course, there's also some grayscales in terms of score. So here we achieved a score of 1 point out of 3, and you have the option when creating the exercise to provide some intermediate feedback for not getting the full score or not getting the lowest score, but maybe something in between. So you can at least have a little bit of not just the two extremes and a little bit in between. And of course, you can export your exercise to Microsoft Word or PDF or some XML version, so some markup that is compatible with Moodle or other learning management systems. And you have the option to share a deep link, a URL with other people so that they can access your exercise directly online in the same view that you just have. And so, of course, you might ask, this is all nice and the exercises are nice, but when I want to start, I don't actually know how I can find the right text or whether the text contains the kinds of things that I want to practice. So this is why we have added some additional metadata. For example, if you supply some vocabulary or a list of words that you are interested in, you could highlight in a text all the unknown words so that you can see, okay, if the text contains a lot of unknown words, it might not be suitable for my learner group. So I would maybe need to find a text that is closer to their current state of learning. This is what I meant by the zone of proximal development. In psychology, and also on the right-hand side, you can find information about text complexity. So in linguistics, there are different implementations or approximations of how complex a text is to read and to learn. So there we have different factors. For example, how long is the text, or how long are the single sentences, how broad is the vocabulary that is being used? Are there many different words, or is it more like the same words being repeated over and over again, and so on? And we have also some grammatical phenomena that are specific to Latin, like ablativi absoluti or something. And so you can really consider different factors and then see, is this text rather easy to read or rather hard? And also, of course, if you want to practice specific phenomena like participles or infinitive constructions, then you might look specifically at those values and search for a text that has high values in this respect. So I've already hinted a few times at the option to supply custom word lists or vocabularies, and this would be the interface for providing such lists. So of course you can choose a certain text that you want to compare against a specific vocabulary, and you can choose the target vocabulary. So for most German schools, of course, this will be the Bamberg core vocabulary. But in other countries, it might be a different list. And then from those vocabularies, you can also choose just a subset. And you could, for example, say, okay, my students have just started learning Latin and they only know the 10 most frequent words, maybe. So you can say that, okay, they only know 10 words. Now show me which texts they can read with those 10 words. Of course, 10 words is a bit extreme, but I mean, you have to start somewhere. And then you can also say how long your desired text passage in the end should be. So if you specify, for example, the whole corpus of Caesar, like the Gallic War and the Civil War, and you want to find in all of Caesar's texts those 3 sentences that form a common paragraph, so they belong next to each other, and the sentences that have a high text coverage for the given vocabulary. So the sentences that can easily be read using your supplied list. And then you can see that on the top right, in the second step, it will give you a list of text passages that match your parameters, and it will give the percentage of text that is covered by this vocabulary list. And so in this specific case here, we could, for example, say we choose the first option because it has a higher matching percentage, and about 80% of the words can be known using this vocabulary list. And so in the third option, you would then have this highlighting and emphasis of unknown words in your text. And then you could, for example, decide that for some of those unknown words, for example, Helvetii or Helvetios, you might actually say, okay, these are of course unknown because it's a name of some tribe, of some specific people, and but it's not a problem because when people read Caesar's text, they will probably understand what kind of tribe is meant here. So other than that, if for some people the text coverage with vocabulary is still not enough. So in some cases, you maybe want to study some specific grammatical phenomenon. For example, people might have problems translating certain conjunctions or relative pronouns. And here in this case, we have an exercise type called keyword in context. So there's a lot of linguistics research on this kind of setup. And the common ground is, the baseline is that you always focus on one specific word or a specific phrase, and then you look at all the different usage contexts. So all the occurrences in a corpus, you find every sentence that contains, for example, a form of qui, quae, quod, and then you maybe give some additional context, like a few words to the left and to the right, so that you can understand more easily which word qui is referring to. And then you can examine those contexts and see whether they differ a lot. So are there many different meanings and many different contexts for qui, quae, quod? Or is it rather that this word always serves the same function and it doesn't really matter which context we choose? Because then we can just rely on other criteria like text coverage through the vocabulary or something. But if the contexts are very, very different, and if it matters a lot which words appear to the left or the right, then this is of course an important factor. And even if we know all the surrounding words, it might make a huge difference because we haven't met this specific combination, this specific context yet. And so it might still be interesting to learn even if all the other words are already known, or even if many of the other words are unknown. We might say, okay, we don't have to translate the full passage, but the context here is still interesting because there's a specific syntactic integration or something. So, of course, you can, when you build such exercises, rely not just on this keyword and context and on close exercises, but also on other exercise types like the matching exercise. And here we have actually chosen all the words to have some syntactic relation to each other. So in this case, the solutions are all adjectives that are referring to a specific noun in the text. And so in this way, learners can, for example, train to recognize syntactic, morphological, and lexical combinations, and because this is all tied together. And when we tried this out in practice, so we actually went to schools and tested those exercises, and some teachers were asking, but that's just single words again, right? This is not a context. But actually, even two words can already be a very, very small context. And of course, you lose a lot of information, but you can still use it to focus on very specific phenomena, like the congruence between the grammatical congruence between specific word pairs. And this might be a very important basis to recognize those combinations in a given text, and then to be able to translate it, for example. And yeah, so, and what you see here is basically the view that the learners would also get. So it's just the Beyer exercise, and with a pool of solutions that they can map. And the end result would be the same as I've shown before in this setup here, where you get some feedback, some scoring, and so on. So when you have created some exercises successfully, you might, or you will probably want to share them with your learner group if you are a teacher. If you yourself want to learn Latin, of course, then you don't have to share anything, or you might not even want to, but you will just complete your exercise and see how you performed. But for teachers, of course, it's important to store those exercises and to share them. And over time, of course, you will accumulate a list of exercises that you created and that seems helpful for you. So maybe when one semester ends and the next one starts, you might want to have a look, okay, what exercises did I use last year? And maybe I can reuse some of that, or maybe some exercises I have to improve still a bit, and so on. And the good thing about our software is that it's publicly accessible by anybody. So you can also see exercises created by other people. And for each exercise, you will have some basic metadata, like the exercise type, the author, the text that was used to create the exercise. And on the right-hand side, you see the text complexity measure. And so you can easily see is this exercise based on a text that is rather hard or rather easy to read. And in the middle, you see the time that the exercise was last used and last accessed. So exercises this is some kind of implicit quality assurance, because if people use exercises a lot, they will always have a very recent timestamp. So you can recognize the popular and particularly well-formed exercises most of the time by their timestamp. And maybe in the future we will also add some usage statistics, so like how many times the exercise was downloaded or completed or something similar. And if this is still not enough, you can, of course, as I said, export your exercises to different formats and store it locally. And you have also the option to integrate it into your learning management system. And so, for example, you have this Moodle XML export, which looks something like this. As you can see, it starts with a lot of angle brackets. And those angle brackets, of course, refer to some kind of code or markup. So actually, what you see is not just the wording of the exercise itself, so the Latin text and the solution, but you also have some metadata, and it's all has some markup so that machines can easily read and understand what the header is, and what the instructions would be, and what the correct solutions are, and so on. So you can basically transport your exercise from one environment to another. So if you are really overwhelmed and say, okay, I would like to investigate the software, but I still don't have a good clue how I should create a good exercise and which text to choose, you can, of course, use some prepared and ready-made exercises. For that, we have collaborated with another university in Potsdam, and they already had a lot of materials in a similar format. So they also had like PDFs and Word documents, but also H5P exercises, for example. And we integrated them in our platform so that now everybody can easily use those exercises. And in most of the cases, these are actually sequences. So they don't just have one exercise, but they have a specific Latin text, for example, some text by Cicero. And here is from De Officiis, and and also from the Epistolae ad Familiaris, and they basically collected different exercises that are ordered in a sequence. So they have a fixed order, and they tell you to start here with this exercise, and then you do that, and then you do that. So you actually have some kind of progression. And this is, of course, an important aspect of learning and of teaching. And you have some metadata, for example, how the exercises are versioned. So if you spot some mistakes, some typos, for example, or if you want to add additional exercises, then you can just create a new version of this entry. And you will know if an entry already has many versions, a very high version number, then you know that, okay, there have been a lot of updates and a lot of work has been invested into this exercise sequence. You have some metadata about who created the exercises and how you can access those sequences remotely. And you have some general introduction, usually in German, but of course you could translate that to English. And you even have some tagging system so that you could, for example, if you want to search for all the exercise sequences that relate to relative pronouns, then you can search for relative pronoun and will find some suitable exercise sequences. And this integration, is based on Zenodo. So if you want, I can show you more about this later. But for now, let me say a few things about our practical studies. So once we had our software, we went into schools and we prepared our own exercise sequence where we tried to simulate an entire lesson in Latin, which is like 40 or 45 minutes. And so we tried basically to model every step that is usually taken in such a lesson, so that you have some initial text, and then before you don't have in the beginning, you don't immediately translate the text, but you rather just skim through it and read it, and you have some introductory texts and so on. And then you have some basic task like marking specific words like predicates or all the verbs in text. And there you don't have to have a deep understanding of what those words mean. You just have to recognize them by their form. But this will then be later important for actually learning the words. So then in the second step, we switch and really provide some harder exercises where people have to, for example, a quote from the Latin text and really pay close attention, and they need to answer some multiple choice questions and so on. And this really, but these are also still not based on translating the Latin texts. Instead, it's only about understanding certain phrases or reading the English version, the English translation. And after that, we finally get to the point where they have to practice their vocabulary by completing some cloze exercises and filling some gaps, for example. And alternatively, some students were also allowed to use the traditional word lists, where they just use one-to-one word equations. So the target of our study was to find out whether there is some difference in vocabulary learning, depending on whether you use the option given above, like where you learn in context only in the Latin language, or whether you take the traditional route of having equations between Latin and German words, or Latin and English words in this case. And so when you are finished with the whole lesson, all those 45 minutes, then you get some overview how you performed in the different parts of the test. And of course, you are all free to do that yourself. Maybe as a heads up, today the server infrastructure at the university seems to be struggling. So the server was down for some time, but usually it's quite reliable. So if you want to try it tomorrow or maybe in a few days, then it should probably be up and running, and then you can use those links to test the sequences yourself. So what we found in the end is that we did not know which people actually participated. So we have a good hint because we have collaborated with certain schools. But since we wanted to protect their data privacy, we did not collect any personal information. So there was no identification or something. People did not provide any information about themselves. We just could see, based on the technical logs, how often different parts of the software were accessed. And so we could identify that 13 people participated. But this is only based on anonymous counting with some unique identifiers that are generated automatically. And so as a method, as I said, we had this was an intervention study with and we had a pre-test and a post-test. So before we went, we gave this to the schools, we performed some initial tests, and we repeated the same test afterwards to see whether there was some improvement. And in the meantime, we had this intervention study where people had different kinds of vocabulary exercises to see the difference. And this was all based only on our software, so we used no additional materials. And on our project website, which is also linked on the GitHub page for today, you can see also some publications about the study, where we describe the results in detail. Maybe just as a small summary, we found that those people who trained, who learned the words in a given context and used the cloze exercises, generally performed a bit better than the ones that used the traditional method, where you just memorize the equations. Here in this plot, the light gray dots actually represent learners that use the contextual exercises, and the dark gray dots represent the others that use the traditional method. But since we had only a few participants, of course, it is not representative, and we cannot easily generalize to other populations. But at least it was exciting to see that there seems to make a difference, like we hypothesized before. So it's not like it doesn't matter what kind of exercise type you choose and how you prepare your texts and so on. And yeah, so maybe to conclude this this part and our study, we really would like to get away from just translating single words from Latin into your first language, and instead we would like to evaluate vocabulary in more complex setups. So of course you can have translation setups, but you should always also have reading comprehension, or maybe certain phrases that are to be translated. So you need more variety and more flexibility in assessing vocabulary knowledge and lexical performance. And this is also in line with our broader understanding of how vocabulary learning actually works. So, of course, we would say that learning vocabulary or acquiring vocabulary is not just a matter of memorizing single words, but rather coupled to other aspects like morphology and syntax. So if you don't understand the form or the integration of a word in a given sentence, in a segment of text, then your chance of decoding the meaning is actually rather low. And yeah, so of course our study in general confirmed our hypothesis that contextual vocabulary learning is beneficial, but yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of work and research to be done, and we would be really glad if you can maybe pick this up and integrate this into your teaching, or maybe in your own research projects, depending on how you want to use that. So now, maybe as a last point, really quick, we want to show that in our software you can also perform some philological research. For example, you can have some corpus from late antiquity, like the Panegyrici Latini, which is a collection of texts that praise Roman emperors. And there you might have, so this is a real setup, and with real research questions that were actually analyzed by Latin researchers that we collaborated with. So, and they have questions like, which words do I need to consider for research about truth and fictionality, and which text passages are relevant for the topic of truth and fictionality. So here we use the linguistic theory of distributional semantics, which basically says that you can use the context of a word, so for example, some surrounding words in a text, to model the word's meaning and to get a better impression of what this word refers to. And so technically we model each word of a text in a continuous vector space. So this is a mathematical approach to using distributional semantics, and this is based on single sentences where we look at which words do co-occur in the same sentence usually. And from that, we can construct some vector space where every word is assigned a vector. And vectors are basically a list of numbers. And on the software side, we did not implement that from scratch, but we reused the popular implementation Word2Vec. And finally, we generated from that some visualizations and some lists of text passages. So in that case here, for example, you could provide as an input the word veritas, meaning truth. And then you would get some other words in this visualization. I've highlighted some of the pairs in red, like simulatio or crederet, suggerendis, excogitandum, and so on. So these words all generally belong to the same topic of truth and fictionality. And so now you already have a good idea which words might also be important for your research, but still you don't have all the text passages where those words occur. And of course, you can search for all text passages now manually using each word, but we have also provided a way where you just input again one word like vera for truth, and then it will find all text passages that contain similar words and not just vera. So the machine understands that vera has to do with fictionality and will find other text passages that are related to fictionality in some sense as well. So you will, again, highlighted in red, you will find many words that belong to this field, but you did not supply them explicitly. And so in the future, we would like, for example, of course, to provide such vector space models for anybody's text corpus. So like for our exercises, in our exercises, you can adapt them to your personal needs. And of course, we would like to also adapt this kind of research method to each person's own needs and to their own text corpus and so on. Currently, this is not yet implemented, but of course, it's technically possible. And also, we would like to dive deeper into this field of AI and train large language models for Latin and Ancient Greek, so that you can perform different tasks like annotating texts or processing those texts for new exercises. So that you have a stronger computational support for your everyday teaching and research. And these models could also be able, for example, to find some metaphorical instances or other rhetorical devices. So things that are rather advanced and would not be easily findable even by humans if they just skim through the text. And if we manage to do all of that, then of course you would need some general infrastructure, some servers and so on to provide this to a range of people. And ideally, they would not just use this to get some results, some insights, but maybe also to publish their results and to share them. So I have just provided you some additional references for the exercise framework, visualization tools, for the text collections that we used, for the search engines that we used, for our source code, some documentation, and so on. So you can find all of that also on the GitHub link to our slides. And I have prepared some exercises for you to so that you can try out the software. If I was informed correctly, the servers at the university should currently be up and running. So if you are lucky, you can even try it now live in your browser. If not, feel free to try again in 1 or 2 days. But of course, I can also show you some examples here on my screen because I have my own instance of the software. But let's quickly go through this. So the exercises have some progression, so from easy to hard. On the easiest level, these questions are about the software in general. So one of the exercise types is not really interactive. So you cannot directly click and do something with it, but rather have to reflect and consider some things. And it would be, we want to know which one is it. And then the second question here would be that you find out which export formats are available for each created exercise. If you listened very closely, I already mentioned it in this talk, but of course you can also just go to the software and if you don't remember it anymore and view some existing exercise and inspect those exports yourself. And also there's one export format that I did not mention in the talk, just as a small addition. And then on the second level, the questions get a bit more tricky. So in the first one, it's which vocabulary offers higher text coverage for the first chapter of Caesar's Gallic War, AGLTT or Troil. So here's one specific text and you have a common question and maybe you want to know, okay, how can I process this text ideally for my group of learners? And the second one would be that you need to find some grammatical phenomenon like ablative absoluti in the first sentences of the Peregrinatio Aeteriae and or the Cicero's De Officiis, so that you can learn to compare different texts for different purposes and then decide which texts might be more suitable. And then on the last level, on the research level, you should inspect the word usage of some specific important words in Palladius text. And these words are pinguis and salubritas. And if you inspect them really closely in the beginning of his work, you will notice some fine-grained differences in how he, depending on the context, how he uses those words. So that's it from my side. Feel free to put your questions and comments in the comment section. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Konstantin, for this really complete, overview introduction to the Machina Callida, which is really wonderful. I removed for a while your slides, so really thank you. And okay, we have a few people on YouTube, and please ask your questions in the chat. We have a comment from Anise. Anise is our colleague and friend from Brazil in Araraquara, where they have been working a lot on using tools in digital classics for linguistic studies. So I imagine that Anise is very interested in this presentation. And definitely I have many questions for you, because at the beginning I introduced this session saying that, okay, the Machina Callida is a tool for learning and teaching historical languages, and specifically Latin. But there is a lot of research, not only because you can use this tool also for research purposes, but because I think that this tool shows how many things are happening in the field that we call digital classics or corpus linguistics and computational linguistics. And okay, so and before asking my questions, in the chat we have a few comments. Let's go on with the comments. Okay, yes, definitely in Brazil there is a lot of interest in ancient Greek, and I'm very happy to see one of your last slides, Konstantin. So the goal is also to move to provide also an access to ancient Greek resources. And let's see, okay, yes, and I go on showing, yes. And then the last, Beyer represents a lot of resistance in relation to language didactics with new technologies. Well, I think, yes, this is a well-known problem, and Konstantin, you mentioned this also at the beginning. This is valid for Germany, but not only for Germany, for other European countries, and also for other non-European countries, like, for example, Brazil. There are many reasons, I think, for that, including also funding issues. And then, okay, I'm showing the comments also for our YouTube followers. And then, okay, Excellency, I know that you are working on this aspect, and also Andrea Beyer mentioned me these different times. There is a lot of work with teachers in high schools in Germany, and not only in Germany. We know that for involving teachers, for allowing them to know that these resources are available. And then finally, okay, yes, there is a first question of Anise. So could you tell us the institutional investment for the realization of your project and the number of people involved? I don't know, Konstantin, if you can answer this question.
Yeah, so the number of people involved, so the core project was made up of like 2 to 3 people that performed most of the work, like implementing things or getting in contact with schools and developing exercise materials and so on. So this is a lot of work, but I mean, we did it for more than 3 years. And then, of course, we had like 4 or 5 additional people who were responsible for project management or establishing contact to some other networks of researchers and so on. So like everything on the management level and coordination level. So officially, the project had all in all then like 8 members or something, and I'm not sure what you mean by institutional investment. If you mean the money, the amount of money that was invested, it was comparatively a small research project because we only had like 3 people actually doing most of the work. So for those people, those are the only people that get paid from the funding agency. All the other people had payment from somewhere else, and they were just advisors basically. And so the core team had, I think, less than €500,000. So it was definitely below 500,000, maybe 300, 400 something, I think. So yeah, usually such projects are not very large in Germany. There's some interest in it for funding this, but not a lot.
Yes, so thank you, Konstantin, for your answer. And as far as I remember, the project was supported by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, if I'm correct. And of course, as we know, in Berlin, there are different groups. So this is okay. There is the project, but there is a collaboration with the different groups, and then, as you mentioned, let's say supervisors, advisors from different institutions, corpus linguistics, ancient philology, classical philology, classics. Which is not the proper term for the German situation, but anyway. So I know that there is a lot of work behind this single project. So this is something really very important. And so going back to also to my questions, we can wait other possible questions. So there are many interesting things. And again, going back to the research component, I think the 2 very significant slides are the slides number let's say 9 and 10, where you mention software requirements and software use, in the sense that you mentioned the workflow, so the data that you started with. And maybe, if you don't mind, Konstantin, I can add again to the stream your slides. If you can go back to slide 9 and 10.
You mean this one?
No. Maybe it was the motivation. Oh yeah, yes, this one and the following one, software use. Okay, this one. So this is, I think, important for our audience, because we have students and people interested in classics, but also in digital humanities and in computer science. So just to have a sense, because we have seen this beautiful tool and the software, what you can do with it. But today, in 2022. Do we have data? Yes, we have something. And you mentioned a very interesting thing. So the fact that we have annotated data, but still we have issues because we don't have perfect data, whatever we mean by perfection. We still have issues because this is the situation today in 2022. For example, here, okay, we have a mention of the availability of machine readable ancient text corpora, and today we have them, high quality automatic or manual annotations. And I think that in this case you refer to linguistic annotated data, mainly corpora based on tree banking, which is something that we have for Latin and Greek, search corpora. Okay, and then if we move to the other slide 10, software use. Okay, this is, I think, very interesting because you used, and I have a few questions here. For example, okay, we know that we have text repositories for ancient Greek and Latin, Perseus is an example, and then we have for linguistic annotated data other corpora, not only Perseus, but Proyal, for example, where we can get data with linguistic annotations for the morphology and the syntax. But for example, you mentioned the fact that you extracted text from textbooks. I think this is interesting. So practical questions. Okay, for extracting them, I imagine that, well, there are here different questions. So can you use these textbooks for, and there are copyright issues, I think. Then did you OCR them? And then the fact I imagine that in textbooks you get single passages, because in our available corpora, usually you have the complete text of extant sources, of course, but from textbooks, how did you do that? I mean, this is important just to understand. So do you have an agreement with, I don't know, publishers for using this data, or if you can answer this question?
Yeah, so actually we have some agreements with the publishing houses, but these do not refer to this extraction of text. So in general, if you don't have such an agreement, you probably do not have the license to distribute those texts as a whole. So you cannot just say, oh, we offer this textbook for download. Now, please, everybody use the whole textbook. The only thing that is usually allowed is that if you provide your own OCR scan or something, then you can provide small parts of it, like to make it searchable or to add some additional annotations, create some exercise from it. So this is usually allowed if it's only like a small extracted part, or you can calculate the vocabulary used in the textbook if you calculate it yourself. So then you have some derived work based on that textbook, and derived work is something else, at least in Germany. On the European level, you have, again, different restrictions, and on other continents, you have still other restrictions. So we had to be really careful to not violate these copyright issues. And in some cases, we went to the publishing houses and asked them, hey, we produced some interesting material based on your textbook. Can we share that? Maybe you also want to profit from that, and maybe you want to offer it as a download on your website, on the publisher's website. And they actually agreed on this, as long as they don't have to invest a lot of effort and don't have to invest money. So if it's like really you provide them with ready-made materials that are really helpful for teachers, then they are willing to host this and to integrate that into their website. But other than that, there's not a high chance that you can easily distribute such data.
Yes, so really, thank you for this complete answer. And this is, I think, important, because you mentioned different issues, but again, this is derived work. I mean, you OCR portions of the text. So you select basically the sources used in these textbooks. And there is a discussion in the community about using source books for different purposes. In this case, we can see a purpose which is a teaching purpose, but we have been experimenting also with other source books, collection of selected sources, for example, for specific periods of time in ancient history. And we have done that, for example, for the collection of sources about the Peloponnesian War, which is a specific period of time in ancient Greek history. So because these resources produced in a printed era and for a printed purpose still are important, because they are already a selection of passages. If you're interested in a specific period of time, of course, you already have a selection of the most significant sources. In this case, of course, using these textbooks or source books, you have a selection done by experts, teachers, and so the work is partly done. So this is the importance of using source books. And I wanted to ask this question because here there are concrete problems to address, like, for example, the relationship between publishers, teachers, etc. And as you said, so basically you OCR those texts, or maybe for recent books you have the PDF where well, still is an OCR. I don't know if you have raw data or machine readable data from those books.
No. In our case, we didn't have to OCR, but we had a plain text file which was not annotated or markup in any way. So we had to provide, because we wanted to integrate it into the citation system, into the canonical text services. So we defined custom identifiers for this work and added all the structure identifiers like passages and paragraphs and so on, so that we could really use it in combination with other ancient texts as well.
Okay, excellent. And yes, definitely at the center of this slide, we can see this reference to the canonical text services. We have been devoting different sessions in Sunoikis about this architecture, which is really important. Now, of course, we don't have the time to talk about this, but again, as you said, so this is an architecture which is important for citing ancient sources. And so this is interesting. And definitely, the fact that you use also tree bank data, there is a connection in this sense, because our tree banks are based on the use of these canonical text services, where basically you can cite and retrieve passages of text, and you have basically URLs that are machine readable, but not only machine readable, but also human readable. So you get really, you keep track of the corpus, the language, the corpus, the text, the edition, and etc. So this is really interesting to see at the center of your slide, this reference. And then you mentioned the rest, so I don't want to repeat the whole thing, because you were very, very clear. And now I go back to another comment by Anise, our Brazilian colleague. Yeah, I don't know if you have to comment this note.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly say that we also discussed this problem. So the question of whether you want to control as many variables as possible in your experiments, or rather study language acquisition in a realistic setting, in an everyday setting. And in the end, we decided, which I'm still in favor of, for the everyday setting. So the students actually performed the exercises while they were at school. And the only difference being that they usually, their Latin lesson happens in a regular classroom. But for our software, of course, they had to have access to some digital device like smartphones, tablets, or computers. So they actually changed the room and went to some of the computer classrooms. And so this was a bit special. And of course, this already has an influence. And also knowing that they will perform some kind of novel test and use some novel software, this is very exciting for students, because they are eager to try out new things. And this will usually increase their performance in general, because they are more motivated to have some variety and something new. And so, of course, there are many variables that we cannot account for. I would hope that if there are many similar studies, so for example, if you in Brazil perform the same study now in your schools, that you would hopefully get similar results. And then if other people do it in Italy, maybe, then and if you get the same results or about the same results in many different countries, then we get close to the conclusion that this really makes a difference. So I see our study only as a starting point and not as a solution for this problem.
Yes, and I think this is very interesting. And you mentioned the fact, and this is really super interesting, so we can go beyond a single classroom single school, a single country, so we can move to different countries, which is one of the goals of these tools in general. So to really to compare different uses in different classrooms, and this is extremely interesting because when we start learning a language, especially historical language, our native language is fundamental. So because it has a strong influence on the way we learn another language, of course. And I think this can be a very interesting contribution to producing more data, because, for example, you mentioned the fact that students, and this is another question I have, so students can provide a translation and maybe they can choose from an available translation, if I understood correctly, or maybe I misunderstood that. But I think, so this is interesting. So, and one of the outputs, so for example, do you create translation pairs, and do you use as training data also translation pairs? I'm asking this because there is a lot of work in our community for working on translation alignment, manual and automatic. So can you say something about that?
Yes, so usually we thought about translation a lot because translation is an important part in German schools. When people learn Latin, they usually always want to translate in the end. Every Latin text that they read, they want to translate, or they have to translate. So this is an important part, and but it's tricky to integrate into such a software because there are one important thing is the copyright issue, because the newer German translations of Latin texts are not free to use. So you cannot just present them in an open source software, and our software should be open source. We wanted it to be available to everybody for free. So we could not use any newer translations, and but the older translations that are free to use are so old that the language that they use, the German that they use, is very different from the German that we actually use today. There are many older words or a different syntax, and we don't want our students to learn this kind of old German. We want them to use like modern German, not colloquial, but modern. And so actually for us, there was not a good solution for integrating whole translations of whole texts and aligning that. So we basically navigated our way around by sticking to intralingual exercises where you only have Latin texts and Latin solutions, and that's it. No translation at all. This is our main focus. And this has some consequences, of course. It has some advantages, but also weaknesses. And in some cases, we have some small translations for single words. This was the case, for example, in the study that we conducted at school, because there we knew that in a regular Latin lesson, translation has to happen. It's like there's no Latin lesson without translating. So we integrated some manually curated translations that we performed ourselves. So all the alignment and all the translations were done by ourselves. And so in the end, we know that there are good technical solutions, or maybe some nice solutions for translation alignment nowadays, but we still don't have the data, at least not openly accessible.
Yeah, so this is extremely interesting, and you mentioned really interesting problems. Again, for new publications, translations are definitely protected by copyright. This is part, I think, of the textbook that you can't use. We discussed this for critical editions, for example. You can use the main text, but not the critical apparatus, because this is really the intellectual contribution, and this is protected by copyright. And the translation again. And then we can't use, of course, all the German or let's say all Italian, English, etc., for didactic purposes. But do you want to integrate in the future translations provided by students with the supervision of teachers and using this as a possible training data? So, and this is a part where students begin to contribute to the production of data. Do you think this is feasible?
I think it is in general, but not with our software. So the problem with our software is that it is research software. It was never meant to be used by all schools in Germany. So of course we made it openly available, so people are free to use it, but we do not have any funding to maintain this or to really support this kind of widespread usage that you would need for things like citizen science or crowdsourcing and so on. So, of course, in theory, this approach is very attractive and would be a good approach for a long-term model of maintaining such a software. But yeah, so in our case, it's not possible. If we get funding for another project maybe, and we can build on that software, then we might think about that again. And I think right now it is already possible for students and teachers to provide their own translations, and these would get stored in our database. And of course, we could use that to train AI models. But of course, you need a lot of data. You need people who are knowledgeable in AI modeling and training. And of course, you need some long-term funding and infrastructure to perform all those operations. And so you really have to have a good institutional background or some additional funding to pull this off. But I think from the theory, from the theoretical side, your thoughts are like very desirable and very attractive. This is where the field should head during the next years.
Yes, I wanted to ask you this because this is a need we have in the community, and I hope that maybe teachers are following us, or maybe they will follow this session later, not live. So this is a need we have in the community, producing new data and maybe involving students in this active role. While learning, of course, with the supervision of a teacher, while learning, they can produce data, so be involved in a research workflow. This is the reason why this tool definitely is not only definitely not a passive tool in the sense that you use it for learning, but there is a lot of potential for producing new data. And this is not only about citizen science, so let's say citizens in a general sense interested in historical languages, but also students. But of course, we are at the beginning, so there is a lot of work already behind a tool like this, because as I mentioned before, so getting data from repositories, and this data is not perfect, but not because people don't work well, but we are in a historical period of time in 2022 where we already have a lot, but not enough. So fortunately, there is work for future decades and future generations, and also because we still need to extract data, for example, from textbooks with practical problems. So I think these are critical questions, but critical in the sense that they offer opportunities for the future. Of course, there is a lot of work in this sense. Then our time is over, unfortunately, still, because really I have many questions for you, but two things. For the exercises, okay, you meant the fact, you said that basically users are anonymous, but it's possible to, let's say, import data in Moodle, for example, and I imagine that the teachers can use, of course, this tool with their students. They are not anonymous. And do you have, let's say, a sort of a tool for analyzing the agreement or disagreement among users? I mean, if users, they solve the exercise in the same way or not?
Yes, so we don't have specific tooling for that. I think there is probably something like this. For our studies, we performed all the analysis either manually, or we wrote some small scripts ourselves to analyze our learning data. So for example, we compared how long does it take the students to complete a certain exercise. Do they struggle with certain exercise formats or interaction types, particularly more than for other formats, and things like that. So we compared the correlation of whether students that perform very nicely on a test are also very fast in completing it, and things like that. You can read some of those things in the papers that we published, which you can find on the project website. It's also linked on GitHub, and yeah, feel free to have a look. Yeah, unfortunately, we did not use any predefined evaluation scheme or tooling there.
Okay, well, I wouldn't say unfortunately. I mean, because in the sense that, of course, the limits of a project like this are limits for every project. But I know the people working on this project, so really, this is great. I mean, and these are questions for the future. Fortunately, I would say I would conclude with a positive remark. I understand that people working on a project tend to see only the issues and the limits, but yes. Anyway, I wanted just to ask this question. Now, unfortunately, yes, we have to finish, and we are a bit late, but this is my fault. And really, Konstantin, thank you. And again,
thank you very much.
Yes, you have the complete class outline. Yes, the Machina Callida is available. There was a problem before, but it's available. And I tried also with my phone to scan the QR code for the introduction to the unit. You can see it also on a smartphone. So for our students living in a post-PC world, you can use also this tool on your iPhone. And then thank you for describing the exercises. Konstantin is very kind, because he told me that you can get in touch with him. If I can, I also paste his email, his institutional email, of course, in the chat, but you can find him, of course, on the website of the Humboldt University in Berlin, and you can get in touch with him for questions you have. Okay, so Konstantin, really, thank you. Now, okay, next week we will have a different session about South Africa, Greece and Rome, classical confrontations in the digital age. So basically we move back to another topic about digital cultural heritage, and we will move also to another country, in this case, South Africa. And then we will go back we'll have another session in June about NLP, but for other historical data. Okay, so that's it for today. I'm sorry I'm a bit late. This was my fault, but I'm a big fan of this project. So I wanted to ask different questions. So again, Konstantin, thank you very much. Thank you to our audience, to our students, and thank you, Anise, also for your questions, and see you next week. Okay.
Thanks. Bye. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.